It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. FIRA USA 2022 will be the unique 3-day event dedicated to autonomous agriculture and agricultural robotics solutions. Featuring 1 day of R&D, 1 day of farm business speakers, and an in-field demo day, FIRA USA will take place this fall, October 18th to 20th, 2022, in Fresno, California. Discover the latest innovations from manufacturers on robotic and autonomous solutions that can take your farm to the next level. Visit FIRA-agtech.com. That's FIRA, FIRA-agtech.com for more information and to register today. Hi, and welcome to the North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today is the Chief Counsel of Government Affairs at National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We're going to talk today about the SEC's proposed greenhouse gas disclosure rule. From Washington, D.C., I'd like to welcome Mary-Thomas Hart. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Chrissy.
So first of all, tell me a bit about your background and your role with NCBA.
Certainly. So I've been with NCBA for about 5 years in different counsel roles. So I've been NCBA's environmental counsel and now work as our chief counsel.
That's great. And do you come from a farming background?
I do actually grew up on a small operation in North Florida. So DC is a big change from growing up in rural America, but I love my job and love the work that I get to do every day.
I bet. That's great. So the SEC's greenhouse gas disclosure rule, it was proposed earlier this year. Last week, you made the statement, the rule would require data that simply doesn't exist on the farm or ranch level and increases the regulatory burden on individual cattle producers. So can you explain this proposed rule and its implication to farmers?
Of course. So, I think we've seen an administration-wide push from the Biden presidency kind of incorporate climate policy into the changes and rules that all agencies are working on and kind of pushing through. So this is the SEC's attempt to kind of fall in line with that larger administrative priority. But the SEC was created to regulate market manipulation, not environmental regulation, right? So this new rule kind of threw us all for a loop because, we thought certainly, EPA has been working on developing emissions estimation methodologies for about 15 years. So it's a little odd for the SEC to kind of come out and require these mandated reports for something that is so far out of their jurisdiction. But what the rule would require is for publicly traded entities that are subject to SEC regulation to submit Scope 1 or direct emissions data, Scope 2 or energy and electricity emissions data, and Scope 3 or supply chain emissions data. So that means that any publicly traded company that sells beef would be required to submit data from emissions from their beef supply chain. NCBA has policy that directly opposes the mandated reporting of greenhouse gas emissions to the federal government. So even though it's through these publicly traded companies, we still have a lot of concern.
Yeah, for sure. And on September 15th, Chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler, said in his testimony before the committee, he said, quote, first, markets work best when they're efficient. And that efficiency is achieved through the tools of transparency and competition. We have projects designed to drive greater efficiency in the treasury markets, the equity markets, and private funds. But from what I understand, this proposed rule is far from efficiency when it comes to the beef industry, for sure. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you kind of plugged that statement from the chair, because I think, we were all kind of confused when we heard him say that. If you're a cattle producer right now, you are about to be subject, or you could potentially be subject to passing along information, up the supply chain when you sell your cattle that you simply don't have access to. Currently, there is no accurate methodology for an individual farm or ranch to accurately calculate its emissions, right? Based on its acreage, based on its precipitation, based on the number of cattle. There are so many factors, and we know that there is no one size fits all calculation for this data that the SEC is proposing to require. On the other hand, you have investors who want access to this information, right? That's the reason the SEC wrote the regulation. Investors are asking for more and more supply chain data. And I think we'll be more willing to share it when we have an accurate way to calculate it. But to put inaccurate data in the hands of investors is not responsible financially. I don't think that it's a responsible decision on behalf of the SEC.
For sure. Those are really great points. And so what is NCBA trying to achieve in this matter? What are your goals?
Obviously, our first priority. So NCBA submitted a set of comments with 10 other national ag trade associations, and we also submitted comments with all 44 of our state affiliate associations, sending a pretty strong message to the SEC that we don't want the agency to require Scope 3 reporting. There are gaps in data. We don't understand how the process is going to work. I think, the agency is largely leaving it up to these private or these publicly traded companies to kind of figure out how they're going to gather this data, which is concerning for us. We at least would like, clear guidance on how they expect this information to be collected. And until they have that, they shouldn't be able to require that data be given to them. So, that's, I think, our first request. Eliminate Scope 3 reporting. The backup to that is that the SEC make explicitly clear in the final rule that if they're going to require Scope 3 reports, that information be taken from existing publicly available data sets. So 2 examples. The USDA conducts a beef life cycle analysis every 5 years where we get an estimated emissions an emissions estimation per pound of beef, right? So that would be something that, the SEC could allow companies to use as a calculation. The EPA also publishes an annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and that tells us about how much the emissions that we could estimate per head of cattle. So those are 2 publicly available existing data sets that could be used by publicly traded companies to report their emissions without having to get information directly from producers. I think we would be happy with that as a backup.
Yeah, that makes sense to use, nothing like putting the cart before the horse when some of these things, right?
Exactly.
We're going to report on data, but we don't have the data yet. So those would be some good examples. Thank you for sharing those. And individual cattle producers, they've sent over 7,400 emails to the SEC and members of Congress expressing their concern over it. What else can be done? Should they still be emailing, still be writing, still be calling?
This has certainly gotten the attention of Congress. So, I would recommend to producers, if this is something that you're concerned about, let your congressmen and senators know, because I think, it is gaining momentum in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. More and more members of Congress are aware of this, are concerned specifically about the impacts to farmers and ranchers. So keeping that momentum up, keeping that drumbeat is going to be really important. In the banking hearing that you mentioned with Chair Gensler last week, we saw concern on both the Democratic and Republican sides of the committee, specifically related to impacts on farmers and ranchers.
Yeah, that's good. And to me, a lot of these regulations, they seem like they're a way for big corporations to kind of pass the buck. Their CEOs can still fly around in their jets and have their big houses, but they're putting pressure on those that are further down the chain, the ones that are closest to the land, in an effort to offset and account for their profitability and whims. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
So I think that may be a part of the conversation. We also watch, very small group of investors who are really only interested in putting their money into environmentally sustainable corporations. And that's really the group that's asking for this information.
Okay.
And we appreciate their interest. We appreciate their desire to invest in sustainable entities. We think that, investment in companies that sell U.S. beef and North American beef is an excellent sustainable investment. We have proven year over year that U.S. beef production is sustainable than beef production in almost any other country in the world. So we work really hard to maintain that. And we think that investors should be able to follow the data and confidently be able to invest in companies that sell U.S. beef.
Right. Yeah. And inviting farmers to the table for this conversation is a super important part, right?
It is. It's always important, whether we're talking about the SEC or the EPA or the USDA. Anytime the administration is going through a rulemaking, having farmers and ranchers at the table is so important, not only because, of the direct impacts to farmers and ranchers, but in this case, I think the SEC didn't even think about the potential impacts to farms and ranches when it proposed the rule. It didn't take the time to engage with the agricultural industry. If it had had one conversation with farmers and ranchers, with the associations that represent farmers and ranchers, I think, they would have seen this coming. But really, they were kind of caught off guard when the rule was proposed, and the ag industry kind of got pretty upset. So I think it's an important lesson learned for this administration.
Right. That makes sense. And switching gears a little bit, in the past, you've covered the Waters of the United States Act. Can you give me an update of where we stand with that today? I know that's something NCBA definitely cares about.
Great question. There's a lot going on right now. So actually last week, EPA sent its final version of the Biden administration's WOTUS rule to the White House. And that's the last step before that regulatory definition is finalized. When that's finalized, it will be the third iteration of a regulatory WOTUS definition. We had the Obama rule, we had the Trump rule, and now we're going to have the Biden rule. And while that's all happening simultaneously, the Supreme Court is going to consider the definition of WOTUS in Sackett versus EPA. That case is going to be heard on October 3rd, 2022. So just in a couple weeks. And we continue to ask EPA to push pause on its rulemaking until we hear from the Supreme Court. But the EPA seems determined to get a rule published, get a rule finalized. So we could certainly be in a space where we have competing definitions of WOTUS, and the agencies are again required to go back and update that definition after the Supreme Court issues its opinion. So it's going to be a busy year in the world of WOTUS.
Yes, it sounds like you'll have to come back on the show after that and give us your take on everything that's happening. It's been a lot of ups and downs for sure.
Yes, happy to come back and talk about WOTUS.
That's good. So, the one last question for you: Why do you serve the ag industry personally?
I grew up in a very rural community, grew up on a farm. My mom was an extension agent, and my dad helped dairy farmers write their NPDES permits, their Clean Water Act permits. So I've been surrounded by it from an early age. I think probably when I was in college, I tried to not work on ag issues. I tried to learn something different, do something different, but it just pulls you back. So came to DC and realized that ag issues are really the only ones that I care about. So happy to be here, happy to be doing this work.
Oh, that's awesome. And thank you for all you do, because we need voices over there.
Thanks, Chrissy.
And where can people find out more about NCBA and what they're doing?
You can go to policy.ncba.org to get the latest on all of the issues that we've talked about today.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, the links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Egg Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram, or AgViews. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And have a great day. Thanks so much for listening to today's Ag Spotlight episode, where we put the spotlight on people and companies doing great things for the agricultural industry. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcasting platform, and give us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on YouTube and Rumble to see the video version of Ag Spotlight. Also, head on over to NorthAmericanAg.com to subscribe to our Industry Connect update newsletter. If you're interested in advertising opportunities, email us at connect@NorthAmericanAg.com. Thanks for listening. Our newest podcast by North American Ag is called What Color is Your Tractor? The stories behind the ag brands you love and the ag brands you love to hate. Hosted by me, Chrissy Wozniak. We take a deep dive into the companies that have built modern agriculture. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Go to whatcolorisyourtractor.com. Available on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.